Meg, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I was following the guide on the weekly news that said 6 and 7. So but you just said 7 and 8.
No, I had it wrong. It is 6 and 7. It's 6 and 7.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. The weekly news is the right one to follow. And then I should remind everybody, we're going to take a break next week because I'll totally not have internet. So we're not meeting next week. We'll finish the book in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, well, Lila's joining us, which is great. So let's start out and with my awful question and tell me what you all thought of this week. Were there things that either bothered you or got your attention?
Well, in chapter 6, she really has laid out the main points of describing what oppression is and things of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, talking about marginalization and powerlessness and cultural imperialism and all that other stuff. And, one of the things I was thinking about this morning is that, African-American women are really coming to the forefront now. And that's because, their voices have been heard. And of course, the way the Black community is treated is so public. And, there's an energy that's around that. It's negative, but it is pushing things up. It's, in other words, is bringing about a certain amount of reform. It's going to take still more time, but the thing is this, we've got a Black woman who is the head of NASA here in Webster, and other women in prominent places. But I was thinking, I've been in this country, I was raised in this part in LaPorte and Baytown and places like that. And I was in school with Hispanic children. But I'm wondering why we don't hear the voices of Hispanic women more. In other words, they are suffering just as much as African-American women are, and maybe in some ways the same. So is it because of a difference in cultures? In other words, Black women, they have been suppressed, but somehow or other they seem to have found their voices and their courage. But we don't hear a lot from the Hispanic women. And this plan here that this lady has, it's excellent. It'll apply to any culture that's being oppressed. I mean, the rules, the things that are spot on here are what people are dealing with and what's causing the problem.
That's a good question, and it's interesting to think about how there's some of these people who have broken the glass ceiling, like Kamala Harris, right, who of course is half Black. But then there's also, Justice Sotomayor, right, who's definitely a Latinx woman.
She's more like an exception than the rule.
Well, both of them are, right? Anybody who breaks the glass ceiling tends to be like Margaret Thatcher was in the 80s, right? I mean, yeah. It's an interesting question that you pose, and I don't know the answer to that. She does talk about, and I think this is really interesting, and I kind of wish we could put this author, Ada Maria Sassi Diaz, in direct conversation with Dolores Williams, because it would be interesting to hear how they think about this, right? But what she says that I think is interesting, probably Dolores Williams would say as well, though, is that there is definitely this sense of internalized oppression, right?
Yeah.
And she uses that phrase, right, about the right to speak, or please listen to me. These are interesting things. Yeah, thanks, Lila, for Lena Hidalgo. Appreciate that. And I do wonder, Meg, if there's, I don't want to say, it's not like you can say there's more or less, but I do wonder how Dolores Williams how she perceives internalized oppression in the Black female community. Because one of the things that Ada Maria Sassi Diaz talks about is this sort of, again, she uses that word mestizo culture, right? This sort of mix about Roman Catholic female roles and household roles and abuse and family. And I see that happening in both groups, but it seems like the Latinx community has the Roman Catholic element and the Black female community does not.
Right, and that is a major difference, yes.
I wonder about that. And she goes on, I did read ahead, I think in chapter 8, where she talks about how Latina women use the Bible. And she says, you know, part of the way that, and this I think might be part of the difference, in the Roman Catholic experience, the Bible is not central to Latinx women. They hear it, but they don't tend to read it. Whereas I think in the Black female experience, which tends to be Protestant, the Bible is probably more prominent.
Yeah, and in the Roman Catholic tradition, it's more, well, I remember that women who were abused by their husbands, if they went to the priest for help, the priest would tell them that they would have to accept it because that's what their, you know, role was. So I see the Roman Catholic male interpretation of Christianity as a major cause for the oppression of women in society in general.
Yeah.
Yeah. For a long time, centuries, right?
And most it's really curious actually, most Christian feminist scholarship has come from the Roman Catholic tradition, which is
and a lot of those
ironic.
Right. And a lot of those women are not, I mean, they have distanced themselves from the church in many ways, but they're still Roman Catholic. But the thing is this, they have found their own independence.
Yeah, but many of them have stayed Catholic. That's the interesting bit. Even though they know their own church doesn't accept their leadership, that's the funny part, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's more to. Well, I don't know. It's just you know, they've learned. I think what they've done is they've learned what things they need to free themselves from. That is erroneous teaching. I think that might be one way of looking at that.
This is why I hate that Graciela is not on the call today, because I actually think that she speaks very powerfully when she talks about her own Roman Catholic experience. She loves the Roman Catholic Church, right? And confession was wonderful for her. And you know, like many of the Catholic traditional bits are wonderful. And I see that as like really strong, dovetailing with chapter 7, which talks about how in the middle of La Lucha, there's fiestas.
Yeah.
You know, and that was this really interesting thing that Julia brought out. It's a creative way to deal with the suffering that surrounds us instead of allowing the suffering to define us. And again, the quote is, "The joy is an act of resistance." And sort of it's interesting to me how, like, I've talked to many people who find who have found their Roman heritage to be very oppressive. And then we talked to Graciela and she's like, "Oh, it's been so wonderful." You know, like it's really cool. Not because she's like not aware of these things, but because she's found really profound moments of celebration in them, which I think is really, really cool that she shared that story with us.
Right. Plus the fact they are now Episcopalians.
Yes.
You see, and I know that there is some friction there with the Roman Church. I don't know any detail or anything of that sort. So, in other words, they've done what a lot of us former Catholics have done, is we've said, no, we love the church. There's beauty in it, but we can find Jesus elsewhere. Yeah.
Lila, you look like you're getting ready to say something. Please.
So, Meg, what you're bringing out, Meg, I felt as well. And I found this hard to read. Again, I just feel so darn white, and I wish Graciela was here.
Yes.
And I wasn't aware I have to admit, I wasn't aware that the Latin culture is so oppressive to women. I kind of had the idea that it was more matriarchal in its focus on family,
Yeah.
and that women kind of ran more of the show. So this was
I think that's true,
hard to read.
I think that's true. And here's, I think, like one of the differences, and I'm going to speak really broad brush, right? But I think like one of the differences, for example, between traditional roles, like when we compare this book to Dolores Williams, right, is that women in Dolores, in the womanist experience, women are definitely running the family, also working. I think that's in common, but I think one of the differences is in ability to express emotion in Latin male culture. There is an opportunity for Latin men, but then there's also machismo, right? And so I think those are some of the differences. So I think just like in Black culture, women do functionally run the home. I mean, that's fair to say, but there's also this machismo role that happens in Latin culture. And I think probably also there's not been structural ways in which men have been split from their families in Latinx culture, unless we're talking about doing things like immigrating and sending money home while also, that is a different way of doing it, other than like the penal system, right, has removed Black men from the family, but I don't think that would be at the same rate that it's happened in the Latinx community. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe I'm overgeneralizing and I'm just sort of thinking.
No, I think, well, one thing for sure, we hear more about Black men being accused and sent to prison. And we know that there are a lot of Black men in prison who are there for crimes they did not commit. Some have even been executed. But you don't hear that much about Hispanics, although there are some there. But it's not the same angst, I don't think, for the Hispanic community, because they had, I don't know, I don't know. I know that their history is that this area was all owned by Mexico at one time. And, beautiful, huge ranches. And in other words, it was a system of power. Whether or not that has an innate sense of respect in people, white people, I don't know. But the Hispanics are quieter than the Blacks.
There are families in my little town here who are descended from Mexican families that were like frontiers people, settlers here, going way farther back than anything white that was ever here.
Yeah.
What was that last thing you said?
The Hispanics here in my neighborhood go way far back generationally than any white. We used to be Mexico.
Yes, we did.
Tim actually gave me a really interesting book about 1.5 years ago. It's called The Injustice Never Leaves You. And the book actually catalogs basically things that the Texas Rangers did that amounted to cultural imperialism and theft, right? And what's interesting is I think that there's really different narratives. There wasn't like a Tejano slave trade that we recognize like there was an African slave trade. So maybe that's part of what's at play here. I don't know. I mean, I think talking about the differences is probably relatively difficult to do, but I do think what's in common is women do tend to, in the Latinx community, run the home and have what she talks about 3 full-time jobs, right? Working outside the home. managing the family and then managing the extended family as well. That sounds right to me.
Well, even, as I talk about the differences, I don't mean to diminish the suffering of Hispanics at all.
Right.
I mean, I just see that, a slight a little difference, and I was just wondering why.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really important. And this is where, again, I wish we could put these actual authors in conversation with each other. Because I would say, right, again, this part about 3 full-time jobs, that seems to be true in Black women's experience as well. What this author did that I thought was really interesting is talks about the disregard that creates for Latinx women's bodies, right? Not only because of sleep deprivation, but she talks about how like sexuality is something that you use because you don't, it's in some ways commoditized for you as well. And it reminds me actually that one of the draws I had to the Episcopal Church was that we sit down, stand up, kneel, genuflect, like that you actually use some of your senses in the liturgy, that there's things like incense and bells, so that there's more like, it's a more embodied experience. And that I think would probably be true in the Roman tradition as well, right? Liturgically, you're more embodied, but then at the same time, she talks about how in this particular, in Latinx women's experience, there's disregard for your body. Anyway, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's just like the body is a commodity for man.
Yeah, and I think she speaks a little bit about like how clergy hierarchy does that, but she doesn't tease it out, I think, as much as maybe would be beneficial. And I think that's part of the thing to think about is, again, like how only men can be priests in the Roman Catholic tradition, and therefore men are the ones who are doing, for example, confession and distributing the sacrament. And that's going to happen in a way in which women are necessarily second-class citizens because their own point of view and experience isn't informing those sacraments.
Yeah, well, just a side note on that, there is a group in the East Coast that are Roman Catholic women, but, the church, and they are ordained legitimately, but the church has nothing to do with them. But, we won't see it in our lifetime necessarily unless this next pope that comes in continues Francis's work. We'll see women priests eventually. And it's closer than it has ever been before.
As they say, we'll get Roman Catholic women priests when the priests themselves have daughters.
Well, some of
that
them
are legitimated.
That are recognized. Yes, exactly right.
And some of them do have children that are hidden.
I want to raise up one thing that Julia asked, and I think it's interesting. It's both looking ahead and behind, right? And she talks about this. The quote comes from chapter 8, but it goes back to chapter 6. She talks about how some of the ways in which the Bible is used, she says critically, the Bible often is used with a private sense of salvation, mainly for the consolation of the individual, and that's a critique. And she talks about how there are these stories in the Bible that become interpretive keys, like Shiphrah and Puah, these two midwives who act in resistance to Pharaoh, even though they may or may not be Hebrew people, to take part in this story of liberation. And to me, it goes back to her thinking in chapter 6, where she says you really can't split love and justice. And this is a similar thing with how mujerista theology uses scripture, right? Is that you can't split scripture from community, liberation, and justice. They have to be all bound up together instead of an individualized consolation, personal salvation. She talks a lot about community salvation. And this is, I think, a really interesting contribution she makes all around, is this very specific language about the false bifurcation of love and justice that I think we've kind of received. I mean, I'll speak for myself. To me, religion was personal, not structural, as a kid anyway.
I have no idea what you mean. Structural? What is structural versus personal religion?
So personal is about, and you can see this, I think, liturgically in songs like My Jesus, My Savior, and can contrast that with things like we're all in this together. And even if I benefit, it's not beneficial to me unless we all move forward together.
That's structural.
I think that's structural. And she's really careful to say that advancement of Latinx women shouldn't happen within the hierarchy we've already got. The mujerista theology is about flattening the hierarchy. So it's not just how can we improve in the game, it's how can we change the rules. I think that's what she's writing about. And I think if I was going to use Stephen Charleston's language, she's saying instead of looking to transcend, we're looking to transform. Ellen, you look like you're ready to say something.
I'm just thinking. I think she said something to the effect of, for the mujeristas to move forward, they have to first have commonality among themselves before they can move outside their culture. Is that, did I get that?
I think that's fair. And I think part of what she would say, which has been interesting talking to Graciela, who said like her experience isn't mine, is she does also raise up, and she talked about this in chapter 4, how other people are a mirror to yourself, right? And how it's looking and weighing in on difference that you start to realize the diversity that you have as well. And I think this is part of the process she talks about, is the difference between using somebody's story and abusing their story, is this like expanded listening. And I do think, well, sorry, maybe I'm losing my own train of thought here, but I think that's really fair. What you're saying is this idea that you're not going to come forward with a core narrative, but you are going to come forward with this commitment to praxis, to right practice, which includes things like listening. And if that can happen among Cubano women and Colombian women and Nicaraguan women, then that's sort of setting the stage for that to happen among all of those men folk as well.
I had trouble in the beginning following her. And I think it helped me to understand that a lot of this she's speaking as a Hispanic in Anglo culture.
Yeah.
And because I was raised or grew up in Victoria, it was very different. The Hispanics there were very different from the ones that are coming to the country now, because they're bringing their culture more forcefully into our country. So I had a little trouble figuring out where she was coming from.
Yeah, and that I think it would be really different if you read this book as a white person in the city of Miami, because Miami has obviously a much larger Cubano presence. And we don't have a large Cubano presence in Texas. We just don't. I mean, not in our area. I guess I'm speaking too much, but that's where I think she says that interesting Spanish phrase she uses, permítanme hablar, permit me to speak, and how that's like double-edged, because in some ways, like you do need permission, and in other ways you don't need permission. And really what it is like permit yourself to listen is kind of how she sort of offers that phrase up. And that seems to me like the interesting, that seems to be one of the hinges she turns everything on, is like having a voice that's strong, but also heard. And, you know, most of the feminist studies that I've read, right, again, sort of say like some ways women are pushed is to be assertive and not wait, which is how men tend to do discourse, but how that's not an inherently female way of doing things. And so like women should have to be men in order to be listened to.
I loved that, because my visualization of that was like, permit me to speak, you know, sort of like stop talking and listen to me.
Yeah.
Instead of that, please may I speak, that comes from.
Well, you know, oh, I'm sorry. Is that, you know, when you think about Hispanic women and how oppressed they have been by the dominant culture, male culture, you know, it takes a long time for a person, and you know, the right people have to come into your life, and you have to be at the right place at the right time to begin to address that issue of lack of self-confidence and self-worth in yourself, and work to get it. And I think that we see some of that evolving in the Black community, whereas it hasn't yet come forward like it needs to in what, Latinx, is that the correct word now?
You know, the reason that Latinx is used is because not everybody is of Spanish descent. Some people are of Portuguese descent. So like Hispanic usually is assuming Spain, but you know, it's interesting how people self-identify, and thinking through whether or not Latinx is something that white people say, or whether or not Latinas prefer to be called Latinx. I don't know the answer to that. I will tell you what's tough, right? It's just linguistically in Spanish, if you have 1,000 women, the group is referred to in the feminine. But if you have 1,000 women and one man, the group is referred to in the masculine. Mm-hmm. And that's a function of language. And what's tough, right, is that like, you probably have to have a fair amount of like luxury and education to bristle against language that's inherently misogynist or hierarchicalized. You know, you have to have a fair amount of education to say, we're not going to talk about heroes that are women, we're going to talk about sheroes. Because if you don't have enough power, people are just going to laugh at that.
Yeah.
I thought she did something really interesting at the beginning of chapter 6, and I mentioned it last week too, but I just, my head is stuck on it. Greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for their friends. She says, no, that's wrong. Greater love has no one than this, that they don't allow someone else to lose their life. That I think is,
that makes more
really
sense,
interesting. Yeah. And I don't want to say that they're mutually exclusive. I think probably holding on to those two bits is real important. I do think at a certain point, being willing to like share your life with other people is important. But I do also think like how that tends to be a masculine virtue. But you know, even if you go off to war to fight for the freedoms of your country, if you leave a widow and children behind, in some ways that's a disservice to your family. So it's interesting to think about both sides of that at the same time. And how I think, you know, if it's okay to say, and I'm not picking on Islamic culture, but I think if you pick up self-sacrifice, you end up with people crashing planes into towers, because that's the ultimate expression of faith. But as you know, Lin-Manuel Miranda writes in Hamilton, dying is easy, living is harder. And I think that's interesting to think about the difference between a single act of extreme faith and seemingly infinite acts of being extremely faithful. And it's not just, by the way, it's not just Islamic thinking, right? In the act of the Crusades, you know, if you were killed, then you went to heaven. And so this was very compelling
Yeah.
to a lot of people.
So I'd like to understand a little bit better about just the structure of misogyny in the Roman Church. What is it? 80% of all churches are women. So why are we putting up with this? It's profoundly confusing to me.
I think we're going to need to read a different book about the Roman Church in particular, but I think what Ada Maria Asasti Diaz really, her conclusion is it's about internalized oppression.
So that's very difficult to change. That's very difficult to change. If a woman's identity, her own self-identity, is steeped in the idea that her body doesn't have value, her voice doesn't have value, her work is undervalued. I don't know how you turn that around.
Well, I think
it's a matter of identity, right? Not just what someone is doing, but how they think of themselves.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
I think that's real important. Sorry, Meg, go for it.
That's okay. Well, you know, one of the things that I noticed yesterday around that Amazon lit space journey was that most of the officials that were responsible for getting that rocket off the ground were women. I've never seen that many women answering questions. I know that there were men and women in the control room. I know that they were there, but I was amazed at how many women were there explaining things that were going on and things of that sort. And I thought, you know, what is happening here that, you know, is this a sign that women have finally broken, more of them have broken through the glass ceiling than we thought before, than we've ever had before. So what in connection with what you're saying, Lila, is, you know, maybe things that will help things begin to change for women. In other words, when women who are oppressed see that women can do these things now, maybe that will give them a little more confidence in themselves or something, or at least they can identify with strong women or something like that. What do you think about that?
I hope so. I think it does help to see Kamala Harris as vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw a little black girl with a big pink neon T-shirt that said, "My vice president looks like me."
Yeah.
So certainly, right? If these Hispanic women break out, make a break for it, isn't their very culture is going to crack, isn't it? Is that?
I don't know that you don't see the black culture cracking, do you? You know, it's well, the Hispanic culture will have to change. You know, what's going to make it change? You know, something's going to make it change. I mean, I just don't see those people continuing to be mentally and emotionally enslaved for the rest of for as long as the generation will exist. Generations.
I think it's really tough. This goes back to a conversation we had a year ago about when monuments were being taken down. You know, like do you censor monuments?
Yeah.
I don't have a great answer to it, but it seems like you can't like wipe a story off the books. It's already been internalized. there has to be some, I don't want to say competing, but I think there probably have to be some like other robust images or narratives. I mean, I would just tell you, right, like watch a Disney movie and you're going to see that women are inferior to men. They need men to save them. Go to the doctor and, like doctors know how to treat things like male infertility or erectile dysfunction, but they have very little like men designed mammograms to be like absolutely undignified and painful. And if it were a man getting a mammogram, it would have been designed differently, right? I mean,
exactly right.
But
yeah.
you like these
He'd
are things
be
that,
crying like a little girl.
yeah, you got it. And so like, but consider how firmly those are anchored, right? Like where can you go and not even the fairy tales that we tell, right? Like our core narratives are about, my wife read this article the other day and shared it with me. She said, do you know why women's pants either don't have pockets or have smaller pockets than men's? And I said, well, I don't. She said it's so they can't do spells. And
Can't do what?
They can't do spells. So they can't do spells. Because women are witches and they carry around like magic in their pockets, which is why the pockets were banned.
Yes.
Right.
That's what I do. It's in my pockets.
That's what's in your pocket is spells, right? I mean, so, I know that sounds crazy, but apparently that's the origin of that. And so so how do you counter that? In some ways you need people who are like, you hold up these sheroes who have broken through. Like you say, okay, look, we've got Kamala Harris, or look, we've now got a woman who has completed Navy SEAL training without having it like watered down, like has done the same training as men have done, right? Or we've got a woman in the Army Rangers. So you've got some of those, but
have women in space.
Yeah, but there's still though is, I mean, those are still outliers. They're not like normal. So how do you normalize, right? And consider religious art. It's really like women are in the supplicant position, right? Or even in the Roman Church, you can direct your prayers to Mary because women listen better than men. So you Mary's the satellite to God because like men don't listen well. I mean, this is sort of like bizarre to think about that.
Well, it makes men look really bad.
Well, it can, or it can make women look like attachés to men. So I think if you follow the first bit, like it probably ought to make men look pretty bad. But I think what we've chosen is, oh no, like women do these things to support their men instead of, boy, men's got a lot of catching up to do. And that's the core narrative that hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Well, I found some of this book kind of heartbreaking, actually.
I do want to say, Julia made an interesting observation to me in chapter 6. She said, she talks a lot about people being in this sort of marginalized position. And she said, but weren't the authors of the New Testament in a marginalized position? And how do you think that affected things? And I think that's a really interesting comment, right? It's probably helpful to say that there was not a empire-wide persecution until well after the New Testament was pretty much all done, right? That only happened under the Emperor Diocletian. There was like local persecutions that happened under Rome. But what's interesting to think about is like there are these moments that show up in Paul's letters, right, where it's not Aquila and Priscilla, it's always written Priscilla and Aquila. So the most important person biblically comes first. So the woman is the more important person in the pair, but we've mapped it the other way. And you don't even have to pay a lot of attention to notice these things. But then at the same time, you get these other bits like, I don't permit a woman to speak in public. And so what's going on there? And I guess you have to think through like how radically different Christianity was at its beginning and how it had to be, well, I guess at least Paul thought it had to be made more mainstream and acceptable. Otherwise, it would have been like Texas hill country crystal practices, like new agey crystally stuff, you know, like when you go with such a radical departure from mainstream culture, it might be too much. I don't know. But at the beginning it was. I mean, you know, you can read through the story of Acts, and the earliest Christians were communists. They were selling their land and like holding all goods, and that didn't work out well. Like we realized that didn't work out really well because they went bankrupt. But that's what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think in a bigger picture, what's happening now is that you have these women in different cultures moving a certain way, but at the same time, it's affecting the men also, and it's bringing new opportunities for them also to reevaluate maybe you know, some of the things that they do. Now, there are some men who'll never do that, and there are some women who will never. I mean, we always have people who have to say, I ain't going to do that, and don't, and they cause a problem. But I think overall, this is, you know, this is one way God is leading humanity to a kind of redemption as these cultures are being renewed. And, you know, and men are affected by that also. I mean, both positively and some of them negatively. So
yeah, I'm going to be really fair on this. I think it's difficult. So here's like one of the things I've observed in the church before is that people are so used to male priests, and I'm going to talk about clergy, that sometimes just having a female priest, regardless of, forgive me for saying this, because I didn't mean this critically, and the same would apply to men, regardless of her work ethic or knowledge base, it's just nice to have a woman in a collar. I've seen this happen before, where I had a peer who was not a great, in my opinion, not a great priest, but was female. And that meant a whole lot for women in a congregation, particularly. Probably it meant more for women than it meant for men in that congregation to see a woman in a collar, even if she didn't have a strong work ethic or knowledge base. And me on the outside, I say, well, look, you know, if you're really gonna break change, you have to be really careful who you put out front, because there'll be extra scrutiny, whatever. And I realized that my own like criterion of judgment is very, very privileged, because I know lots of male priests who are terrible priests. And here I found myself thinking like, why are you loving this person so deeply who is not a great priest? And it's almost like you're just really glad to have this woman priest. And that actually was the case. And that's not wrong. Like that's part of how change happens.
yeah.
But it's interesting to think like in a merit-based competitive system, how you can find this stuff going on in yourself. But of course, it is really important just to have bodies in a role, different looking bodies, female bodies with long hair, pregnant women bodies in a collar is really important, just to see if that can happen. So I just want to say, I still think it's really, really tough, you know, and I think that's part of the deal that I think this is part of the reason why a lot of people are really loath to say there's systemic racism, because there's like, well, look, I worked really, really hard. Yeah, sure, fine, you worked really hard. So why is it a challenge to you that somebody else has got a role when, you know, there's lots of men who aren't working hard who also got that role? I mean, I think this is like part of what's going on. I don't know that I explained what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I do. I got you.
Mike, I would not want a woman to replace you.
Well,
I'm just saying, I think that you are pretty special in your point of view and your support of women and your understanding, your sensitivity to the challenges that women face. And also, I really did like, I have to say, I really did like having Jenny here.
Mhm.
And for me personally, I do get a sense of comfort when I see a woman at the helm. Like
that's
when I'm
what
on
I'm trying to speak to. I think it's really,
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah, I agree with Lila. And by the way, y'all do know that Jenny's pregnant.
Mm,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Which I
Anyway,
think is probably going to be a really big gift. And I don't even want to talk about anything else, just iconically, that's going to be a really big gift to her parish, because it's
Yeah.
very rare that you see that.
yeah. Yeah, and Mike, I don't want you going anywhere either. You
Well,
know,
thanks. I don't, again, I don't have any plans, but I do think like what you said is important, Lila, but like I think, again, I don't, in some ways it's like, well, we don't want like token people, but at the same time, tokens are important. So
well,
like,
let's don't, yeah, as long as they don't have too prominent a position, if they don't do the work.
well, but I would say, and this is where I have to like talk to myself a little bit about this. I know lots of men who don't do any work, and they're
Mhm.
entitled to their position. So why am I real mad when there's a woman who behaves like a man? And you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Mhm.
and I think that's important to raise up. I mean, I'm just going to tell
Oh.
you, if you spend like multiple hours during your week playing spider solitaire as a clergy person in your office, you really should like check yourself.
Yeah, that's addiction.
We'll just go home. I mean, but
Yeah.
don't be playing spider solitaire in your office computer. Like something's not right. I just, again, like something's not right.
Mhm.
mm.
There's nothing wrong with spider solitaire. Don't get me wrong, right?
Well, yeah, we understand.
But when you feel
Yeah.
entitled to your vocation, and I will say there's a lot of entitlement that comes with being a clergy person. Like I feel entitled to lots of things. I probably shouldn't.
Well, that's, the way it is. And
Well, it's having women clergy who aren't up to some people's standards, high standards, is still important, I think, because it's a step. It's a step toward more equality, and God willing, we'll have female clergy who are very effective in their priesthood, and
Yeah.
And it won't be a rarity any longer.
Mhm.
This is why I wish I could say publicly, we need women vergers so that women and men can see that women are vergers.
Well, you're going to have one pretty soon.
We're going to have one, and I wish we had more. I'm serious, and this is why we need girl children serving the chalice, and this is why we need women being senior warden, because it's a place of public prominence that serves not just women but serves men.
I think it's a really important, and it's part of our inclusiveness that we strive to accomplish in everything we do here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, that's why, this is why, like, sometimes I don't even know how to advertise this. Sometimes I wish you could say, you may not be interested in being a verger, but you owe it to women to do it as a woman. If you're able-bodied, you know what I mean? Like, I don't mean you have to do it, but it needs to be done. So the question is, can you do it? And that's an interesting way to look at things like like ministry, to be honest, and say like, hey, this may not be what I would most like to do, but I see it's important to do it.
I'm going to give that some thought.
I hope you will. I hope you'll give it some thought. I mean, again, like I don't say this on Sunday mornings sort of openly, but it's important, right?
Yeah.
It's important.
Yeah, I think what I'll even do is make an appointment with you so we can talk that over.
Well, mull it over in the back of your head first. I will tell you, Ellen is going to be trained as a verger.
Good.
And serve as a verger.
Oh, this Ellen?
Yeah.
This Ellen. Yes.
Oh, right. Okay.
Now, look, I know people who've got things like tremors or mobility issues, and being a verger is not a good choice for them. Or I know people whose schedule is like, is not really amenable to that. And I get that. And by the way, I'm not ever going to prescribe that this is something that you ought to do, but I think it's great having adult women acolyte. I also think it's great having adult men acolyte. I mean, it's nice having adults acolyte. Yeah. That's really nice.
My brother has been an acolyte in his church for years, and he loves it.
I do think there's something that, coming back a little bit to what Julia said, and I want to talk about Margaret Thatcher for a second, right? I mean, the thing that Margaret Thatcher did is she was more of a man than most men, including the way she wore clothes, right? That was when women wore shoulder pads, so that they could have strong, square shoulders, right? Mm-hmm. And Margaret Thatcher was not known for compassionate dialogue. She was known for strength, right? Yeah. And that's fine. That might have been who she was, but I do think there's this bit like, when you're a marginalized person, do you have to behave like the dominant group, or are you allowed to be yourself? And so I want to draw attention to this quote my wife sent me. In times of stress, there are fight, flight, and freeze responses. Women tend to form coalitions. And I just think that's really interesting, right? So if the normal response, fight, flight, freeze, and you're female, and your natural response is form a coalition, do you have to convert in order to be a woman in leadership? And I do wonder, when we talk about authors of the New Testament being marginalized persons, how much conversion have they done in the work that they're doing? And I think that's actually really fair to say. I don't think Paul wrote the Timothy's. Personally, I don't think that. I think it was a student of his. Yeah. But when somebody says things like, I don't permit a woman to speak in public, how much of it is this cultural thing? And by the way, what's great about that scripture is that's Paul talking, not the Lord. Or when you read 1 Corinthians, and the author says, doesn't nature itself put a man to shame to have long hair? Well, actually, I mean, your hair naturally grows long on its own, right? It's like no natural mechanism for cutting your hair. That's all artificial. And so like, it's a really great way to say like, boy, no, nature does not put a man to shame to have long hair. We do that or did that, and so, it's interesting to think through how much of culture is tied up even in the authors of scripture and why they felt they had to do that, which I will tell you, sometimes I start to worry like, oh, am I going too far? Because you don't, and I think that's a legitimate question. And I think this book ties into that, right? If you lose everybody but 4 people, well, then you've lost everybody. So how do you hold the vessel together, but also go somewhere? I mean, that to me seems to be the challenge.
Yeah.
I will say, again, this is a more academic book. I think it probably does a really good job talking about structures explicitly, albeit academically, more so than the other books that we've read. I think that, when she talks about the justice challenges, she says there's systemic violence and there's cultural imperialism and there's powerlessness, marginalization, right? exploitation of labor. And then she talks about how mujerista justice happens, right? Like you have to have praxis, and it has to be concrete and contextual, and it has to be a discontinuity with past oppression. And I mean, these are really good structural ways of thinking.
Yeah.
I think they're really good. And of course, hey, there's no Latinx Barbie doll. Let's just be honest. And these are like helpful things to think through.
Mm.
Any last thoughts on this book? Again, I hope you're enjoying it. My favorite, I do want to say my favorite thing, and I've said this before about this author, in her first book, which is called In La Lucha, the kind of the axis of the book is the word kingdom of God, the kinship family unit. And she talks at great length about how kingdom is hierarchical, it's masculine, it's not serving. And
this was earlier.
Yeah, and this is one of those things that she really develops in that book. I for some reason, I had thought this book was going to do more of that work, but I love that image. It's an easy image. You don't have to even change any of the language. You're just dropping the letter G, which is kind of easy to do, right? Like whether you're singing a hymn or you're praying a prayer, you can just use the word kingdom, and it actually makes a really big difference.
Yes.
It does.
And I think like what I wish she'd, well, I'm just going to say, to me, that's still the central axis for this book, is how do we go from a kingdom model to a kingdom model? And I think this book is really trying to get us to do that through the mujerista specific like shoes. How do we make that journey?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I'm grateful
Thank
for you all. And in 2 weeks, we'll come back and we'll finish this book up. And then just think in the back of your head if we want to take a break or if we want to continue doing some of these studies. I do have in mind that there's this really great book by Elizabeth Johnson called She Who Is.
Yes.
About the use of language. And she's a nun. She's still a nun. But she's written this heretical book.
Yeah, and she's sort of more independent now too.
She is.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good.
Well, I value you all very much, ladies, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon.
When